Hey everyone, this is David Wolinsky back with another interview from the audio archives of NoDon'tDie.com. This time I'm bringing to you the first half of my Q&A with Per Strömbäck, who's a Swedish game industry spokesperson. He and I talked on December 18th, 2017, and if you'd like to read transcripts of other interviews I've done, please hop over to NoDon'tDie.com. Otherwise, if you'd like to support the work that I'm doing, links for that are down below, like my Patreon. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and now here's Per Strömbäck. Thanks.
Sure thing, thanks. So my name is Per Strömbäck, and I'm the spokesperson for the Swedish games industry. We're a business association. We have about 100 members, so game developers, the game distributors, some tech companies, particularly focusing on games, game educations, and some other supporting members like some law firms and auditors and things like that. So, but the majority of our members are game developers, big and small. Some of the more famous members are Mojang, King, Avalanche, DICE, Massive Entertainment, Paradox, and some others. My job is to help the members look after the things that they don't do themselves for whatever reason. So things like access to investment capital, government liaisons, trade stuff, lobbying, media work, education, labor market stuff, industry information, so data gathering and publishing reports and stuff like that, both to help the outside world understand the industry and to support our members. A lot of different things on our agenda. And my professional background, I've been in the games industry since '96. I've been in this job since 2005. I've been a game developer for a while. I was a partner at a small studio in Stockholm, Sweden, which is where I'm still based, by the way, called Monsterland. We made a game called Rock Manager, released in 2001, sold to 14 territories, failed 14 times. I like to think that it predicted some of the music hit games that came after, like Guitar Hero, SingStar, but I don't know that they would agree. And I also spent some time as a games publisher with a local publisher called Panvision. Like everybody else, I started out in QA back in '96.
So, I mean, maybe this is kind of an obvious place to start, but at least in the West, when people talk about Sweden and games, I'm sure you can probably guess the handful of things that come to mind, like PewDiePie and Notch. You mentioned Mojang. What do you think still needs to be represented in the character of Sweden's gaming industry and culture? Like what's the full picture that people won't be getting from just those two names?
Yeah, I think there's a point in there that the games industry is not so good at bringing out its stars. There's only a few people that have become stars. In other industries, we talk about movie directors as auteurs, and the movie is about their subjective vision. That's not the way we talk about creativity in games. So people like Notch would be the exception. Rather, we think about games as a collaborative effort. It's teamwork. It's a creative team effort. I mean, if you look at the advertising industry, they talk about copywriters and art directors, and they're the creatives. They win the awards at the advertising shows, they look at creativity as a very individual trait, whereas in games it's more the group. If you have a team of people that can create magic, that's the most precious thing in games. So that I think is one takeaway just from your question, the way you phrased it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's interesting. It's something that I'm trying to get my head around. And that's also part of the Swedish story, because Sweden is all about collectivism and teamwork. We always put the collective over the individual. That's the way we're brought up. That's the culture heritage. That's it's in our society, and I guess in our DNA to some extent. So that's part of the story about Sweden. We're great at teamwork, and we're great at organizing for teamwork. It comes easy to us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say that you have to be a born Swede, there's no racist agenda here. I think this attitude also makes it easier to integrate people from other places, because looking at some of our member companies, there's more than 30 mother tongues in some of our member companies. So I think that's helpful in that aspect. But I think the downside of that is that we may not appreciate the individuals the way some other industries do. For example, and this has been my experience, when somebody from the outside criticizes our industry, for most cases it's about depictions of violence, nobody steps up and has an artistic response to that, maybe saying, well, oh, you felt bad? Well, I had a difficult childhood, so I wanted you to feel bad because, that's been my life. That's something a rapper can say, or a filmmaker, or a novelist. But no games developer would ever say something like that. And I think also there's a pitfall, and I know I'm deviating from your question.
No, that's totally fine.
But there's a pitfall where, because we don't have individuals as faces of the industry so much, we can come across as kind of faceless corporate organizations that are driven by greed rather than artistic expression. And I think that's an unfair image of the motivation for games developers. I think, of course, there are business people, and I'm sure there's a level of greed, but the reason people start making games is not to make money. It's because they love to make games. So I think that the focus on creativity as a team effort is a blessing and a curse. And I think we can, there should be a way where we could take the best parts and still have some more prominent people, some public faces speak out. And you mentioned Notch and PewDiePie. In a way, those two are kind of unlucky examples, because both of them have gotten in trouble for what they said on social media recently.
Yeah, that's true. Recently, yeah.
So it's like both of them kind of fell from grace. I don't think that takes away anything from their previous accomplishments, but it's still. I don't really know what that says. It's something about at least in the case of Notch, he was part of a team, though it was, Minecraft was certainly his creation, and now he's not connected to it anymore. I don't know, the amateur psychologist in me, would love for him to find a new purpose. I don't know, maybe he has one. I haven't spoken.
Yeah. With
him, but from the outside, and his public image, I think it would help if he had a purpose that he could talk about. Anyway, so because I don't know, I mean, you see this happening in other places as well, but there's no real template for how a successful games developer or games profile. What's their second act like? So that's, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure that's anything to do with Sweden. Maybe that's to do with fame and fortune and
that's interesting.
Like
I mean, why isn't there a template? Because certainly the industry has been around long enough where, when I go to GDC, I see a bunch of gray hairs. So, you know what I mean? So it's like, why is that? Is it just in general a disinterest people have with learning from history, or is it just because people haven't been able to, make a go of it in games all the way to retirement, or is it just because that's happening now and we don't know what that looks like?
I think most of us are so safely what's the word? We're in the comfort zone of our cocoons of the teams. It's very few of us have been exposed to the media and having to face the outside world without being a part of the team. So I guess maybe that's the flip side of teamwork. But I don't know. I mean, it's not like I've spent a lot of thought on that. And you were asking for a more fair description of Sweden.
Well, I guess just what elements from Sweden gaming culture or industry that you think should still be represented.
So, I mean, we do have a disproportionate number of hits. And I think one of the fortes of Sweden just from the economic perspective of the games industry, is that we have a wide variety of different genres. I mean, Minecraft, Battlefield, and Candy Crush are very different games. So in a way you can say that Finland is more successful than Sweden, but that's because Supercell makes even more money than anybody in Sweden. But it's unfair to call it a monoculture, but it's much more heavily focused on mobile games in Sweden. So we're blessed to have this variety of different types of games that are hits in different genres. I guess that's part of it. And if you there's a lot of different answers and explanations why Sweden of all places became successful. But at the core is two items of popular culture in the 1980s. And one was a role-playing game, kind of a version of Dungeons and Dragons called Drakar och Demoner. And for all the nerds out there, it was a translation of an American role-playing game called Basic Role-Playing. Weird name. So that brought a generation, or it taught a generation of, first generation of nerds about game design. And that was the first. And the second was the Commodore 64, which gave the same kids programming skills. And if you have game design and you have programming skills, that's the combination you need. So in order to be a successful hub of games development. So it's these two phenomena of 1980s youth culture or pop culture, and all of the famous companies from Sweden were founded by people, white male, and there's a diversity challenge in there. I guess we can talk about that too. Born between maybe 1971 and 1978. And we all did, because I'm also part of that group, share this. And I know that's the same story as in many other places, but Sweden had this maybe more than other places. That brought a generation of game designers who became game designer, programmer, entrepreneurs who started these companies.
Well, this might be a chance to talk about some of those diversity things you mentioned. I'm sure, I don't know if you remember this or not, but I picked up on something in the talk you were giving out in Visby, and I think our first conversation was I was asking you a little bit about She-Ra and He-Man, and I know this is something in my research I've seen that you've actually have talked about a fair amount, which is Sweden's consumption of the pop culture diet of the English-speaking world. Um, and I won't take offense with this, but I guess I'm curious. I mean, in hindsight, are there things about Western pop culture that you wish Sweden wasn't trying to emulate, or that it wasn't fascinated by, that it went a different direction instead on?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think we built our success on our weird interpretation of Western pop culture. You know how there's a subculture in Sweden, not my generation, but people born in the 40s and 50s, who keep these American cars from, pre-oil crisis, 1950s, 1960s, Chevys and Buicks,
Sure,
cars. There's a subculture, we call them raggare. Thousands of these cars, and they meet in the summertime, and they drive these cars, and they keep them in perfect condition, and they go to these big meets, and there's tens of thousands of people, and they get drunk and they vote who has the best car. And some of them have the Confederate flag. It's all about trying to be more American than the Americans. The girls dress up like they were going to a diner in a movie from the 1950s. And so we're absolutely fascinated with Hollywood and American, car culture and all that stuff. And a lot of the culture theorists in Sweden say that that's because there's a backlash from our failure to participate on the side of history in World War II. So we have this guilt because we didn't help in World War II, at least not as much as we should have.
Do you think that's true? Does that feel true to you?
Yeah, I think there's a point to that. I mean, our neighbors got in trouble. Denmark was invaded, Norway was invaded, Finland fought bravely, and we were neutral, and we allowed the Germans to transfer troops through our territory.
Yeah.
The option would have been to be invaded like our neighbors, but we didn't put up a fight. So there's this collective guilt around that in Sweden, and also we benefited from that because after the war, when the rest of Europe was in ruins, our industry was still standing. So we could we made lots of money making manufacturing goods and cars and machines and stuff, and selling it to our neighbors. So it's not only did we chicken out on doing the right thing, we also benefited from that, and that's really a big part of what built our wealth here as a society. So we have a lot of payback to do, and I don't know, maybe it's a weird way to do it, looking after American cars from the 1950s and
paying homage. Yeah.
Weird interpretation of that, but there's definitely a link there.
Is there anything about Western pop culture, either today or through the decades, that just totally mystifies you, like why it's popular?
All right, let me think for a second before I answer that. Maybe just to bring this car culture to what you said about He-Man and the Masters of the Universe.
Yes.
And Transformers was another.
No, that's right. We talked about all those.
Yeah, and that had to do with cable television in the early 1980s. It was about the same time as Dungeons and Dragons and Commodore 64, maybe a couple of years before. And now actually it strikes me that from Japan we had Game & Watch, so the early Nintendo Game & Watch, which was also around that time. So that was also a popular culture influence on the same generation. But before cable television became popular in the 1980s, we had nothing. We didn't have cartoons anything animated. Oh, we did have some, Eastern Bloc, Czech and Polish puppet shows. That was the animation we would get. And then 1 hour of Disney on Christmas Eve. It's true. That was television in growing up in Sweden in the 1970s and early 1980s. So, being starved of pop culture impulse like that as a kid, and then almost from one day to the next, the bounty, the plentifulness of the plethora of animated entertainment and bodybuilders and guns and stuff, all the things that, I mean, there was this, if you were a responsible parent, sorry, I'm all over the place now, but if you were a responsible parent in Sweden in the 1970s and 80s, you wouldn't let your kid watch these American shows because they would have a bad influence on their upbringing. So, for example, the Hulk with Lou Ferrigno, that TV series? Yeah. That aired on Swedish television, but I wasn't allowed to watch it. I wanted to, but my parents wouldn't let me. Or there's never mind, I can go on about this. So we have this ambivalent, that's the point, we have this ambivalent relationship to American culture. Is there something we took that I wish we hadn't? I think there's a different point in there. I think the games industry has been too obsessed with photorealistic visuals. We wanted to make it look just like a movie, and that's been great. I mean, it's driven innovation and all these technologies, but as an artistic idea, it's not as interesting as trying to make something that doesn't look just like real life. So I think we're now in the era where we start to experiment with other types of visual aesthetic ideas, and I think that's a much more interesting development. I wouldn't say though that comes from Western pop culture. I think that comes almost from a lack of imagination.
Well, that actually goes really well into my next question, which is, what do you wish games in general were better at doing or able to do, period?
I think we're about, we're all about having fun. That's the idea of a game. But we could do more experimenting with that concept and challenging our own ideas of what a game should be. I think the indie scene right now, or for the last 5 years or so, has been doing a great job experimenting with different gameplay mechanics and different aesthetics and different ideas around characters and narratives, whatever. I didn't used to love the indie scene. I used to think that they were all doing asteroid clones.
Yeah.
And I still think that was true to some extent, maybe 10 years ago. But I think now the indie scene is really, really interesting with, figuring out new ways to play and new thoughts about what games can be. And I think we see some of that coming into the mainstream. I'm not sure the economy around games is necessarily built to support that, though. I think the AAA games are inevitably moving in the direction of bigger budgets and bigger brands. And there's lots of new stuff that can happen in that space, but it's not a recipe for radical experiments.
No.
And I think that the economy around games in the indie scene or in mid-sized games, it doesn't reward the games developers enough. There's too much content, too few people want to pay, Everybody dreams early access or Kickstarters or whatever, but it's very difficult to succeed. I mean, there's definitely room for optimism. There's if you look at maybe Roblox. Have you played Roblox?
No, I don't think so.
It's kind of a sandbox of sandboxes. It's a game where you can make games that other people can play. So it's taking this idea of player participation to its extreme. If Minecraft was a sandbox of building blocks, this is a sandbox of game development elements, which allows, So there's, I mean, how cool is that?
Well, you were saying, it seems like it's bringing a trend to its conclusion or natural next step.
Yeah, and I think that there's definitely cases like that are artistically and radical and innovative and creative, and that they also make some money. So I think that's helpful. But on a general scale, I think the economy around games is not. It's not about too much money going into AAA. That's not what I want to say. I'm saying that because the way that the markets works, there's too many games competing for the attention of the player. There's too little money paid by the players. The marketplaces, the big online marketplaces, have a lot of power, which is disproportionate to the risk taken by those who make the games and spend all that time and money making them. So it's I think we need to find a more sustainable economy to support all kinds of games. Besides the single hits, the unexpected hits like Roblox and the big name games. We need to develop a better economy.
Well, this ties into something that you had emailed me when I asked you those couple of questions. I mean, you said that some devs are dogmatic about not wanting to deal with business or seeing marketing as a weakness. I think the sort of not understanding how business works in general also extends to media and fans. I guess, like, why do so few people in games in general understand how business works, you think? Is it just like the classic, like, oh, I'm an artist, I shouldn't have to bother myself with understanding how I'm actually going to earn money, or where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, and also, the irony with the image that some people have outside of our industry, that we're just these capitalists trying to enthrall the kids and take their money. It's so different from what you just said. Well, I think it's part that I'm an artist and I want to focus on my work, and I think that's particularly true in the indie scene. I think there's also an aspect of engineer identity. If you're an engineer, you're all about product development, and you think, marketing is for losers. And I think it's also part of the mythos around the digital economy. Everything should be free, and there's always a different way to make some money, and it comes if you deserve it. Tesla doesn't need to do any marketing because the cars are so great, etc. Obviously, there's lots of marketing. They just do it differently. Of course, Minecraft did a lot of marketing
mentality.
Yeah, exactly. And Minecraft is a beautiful example of how you can do marketing without it looking like marketing. I mean, inviting players to pay in the alpha stage. Now early access is overused according to some people, but the idea, I mean, the beauty of how Notch did it when he got paying customers to be ambassadors for his project, and also part of the development team. Any normal any normal customer is upset if there's something wrong with the product, but in this case they were happy because they could report the bug and help improve the experience for everybody else. And also Notch was really great about being transparent about his dev decisions and things like that. And other people do. Paradox, to take another Swedish example, does it really good, involving their player forum to make business decisions and design decisions, etc. So there's definitely some new ways to do marketing and sales that we have developed as an industry successfully. And some people will say, well, that's not marketing or sales, which is true because it's not in the traditional sense, but it's doing the same job. And I think that there's kind of this unfair stigma around it. I wish that we could have a more sober conversation about this. I mean, what's the use of throwing the best party in the world if you're not going to send out any invitations? That doesn't mean we have to become marketers more than games developers. But when we don't take those issues seriously as developers, we're kind of confirming this idea that only the suits can do sales. It doesn't have to be like that. Or we can, work together with the suits, whatever. I guess I'm a suit.
Are you wearing a suit right now?
Yeah, or at least a jacket. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you're just a snappy dresser.
Well, I used to work for a publisher, so I guess that makes me a suit. So anyway, I think there's an unnecessary stigma around that. But in a way, it's also helped us come up with new ways of marketing that doesn't look like traditional marketing, that other people can learn from outside our industry.
I mean, that's sort of another classic cliche about these, artistic industries, which is that sooner or later, quote unquote, the suits come in and overstep their bounds and, kind of ruin things, or they calcify things. I mean, how do you think that that's overstated in games, or how that version of history is too simplified?
Yeah, I mean, if most game developers I talk to, I think maybe one or two exceptions, they say they love games and they wanted to make their love of games their job. And if it's a job, I mean, I'm all for that. That's what I did. But if a job, it comes with an economy. It's part of the economy. A job is what you do to make money. It's great if you love what you do, and many cases that can be more important. But the money is going to be there. You cannot disregard it. There's nothing bad. It's just a fact of life. If it were any other way, that would be weird, because that would be saying everybody else has to work to feed me so I can do my important art, no matter if it means anything to them. That's not a very nice attitude.
It's selfish.
Yeah, very, very selfish and completely unrealistic. I mean, that's a surefire way to not get what you want. So in a way, I think a lot of so here's an irony. A lot of game devs maybe think that they're more humble than the suits, but in a way they're less humble than the suits. If we think like that, we're less humble than the suits. In a way, if you take money seriously, you're humble about what other people want, not only about your own wishes. So I guess there's a balance there. If a game developer, or if a team of game developers do great things, they have a reason not to be so humble, and then the suit can remind them about the outside world, and that's, the outside world is humbling. So you have to make something that's in the interest of somebody else and not just yourself.
That's interesting, because that again feeds into something else you had said to me in an email, which is that it's weird that games has so much in common with other industries, but refuses to realize it. That's a very big reason why I started working on this and just started talking to people and sort of letting, knowledge and wisdom and just perspectives from other industries sort of seep into games mentalities. But I guess like, when did you start to notice that games has that attitude, and why do you think it still has that attitude?
Mm. I mean, I personally am totally guilty of that sin. I've always thought of games as something special and different, and our industry is so unique. And I said a couple of times in this conversation that we have come up with new ideas that other industries haven't, and how we're so special. We're different from ads and movies, whatever. And I still think so. I still think the games industry is special. I still think games are special and unique and different, and that's why I love to be involved in this industry. But again, there's this lack of humility, because that stops us from learning from other people. If we think that we know everything, that stands in the way of becoming better by observing or taking some experience from somebody else. And just to take one example from my work, what I try to do, or part of my job working for the Business Association, is to try to develop new structures to help the industry. So, for example, we had a company called Grin. They made some great games in the noughties. So a game called Bandits, which was kind of a post-apocalyptic vehicle fighting game. And they went on to work for some of the big international publishers. But they were a victim of the credit crunch and the financial crisis. And that hurt, because they were one of the biggest games developers in Sweden at the time. So we were really sad to see them go. And I was thinking, from the perspective of the ecosystem around the game developers, how can we avoid this? Is there some kind of insurance? Do we have? I mean, from that grew better business models and self-publishing and stuff like that. But then it turns out that the Swedish government already has a system in place of insurance. If you're selling services to a client in another country, you can take out an insurance that is underwritten by the Swedish government for that revenue. So if you get in trouble with that client, not only will you be paid by this government agency, they will also take your legal battle and fight it in the courts with the client. So had we known about this agency, which has been used by all the other, or many of the other export industries, the trucks and pulp and paper and whatever we sell from Sweden, had we known about that, we could have saved Grin. Maybe they could have lived. That's the exact kind of thing that this agency is supposed to do, protect the local companies. So what I had, the thing that I was wishing for, the analysis I did for myself after that event, that was already in place from a different industry. Maybe with a more humble attitude, I would have already known about that, because other industries have had the same problem many years ago and came up with this solution that can also be used for our industry. So there's a lot of problems that are not unique to our industries and that we can solve in the same way as other industries did. We don't have to reinvent that wheel. And that doesn't make us any less unique. It just makes our life a little easier.
Yeah, and I think some of this comes from like you know, of these other industries, it is the newest, and so it's the youngest, and so you know, I think that's a very human thing of thinking that these are, you know, problems that haven't been solved yet.